So, if this morning was a little bit of kind of ghost of Christmas past, this is very much ghost of Christmas present. And we're going to be hearing from Helen about a topic that came up a lot in discussion, you know, kind of where are we now, a kind of a look and summary at that before we actually look at some of the regional research frameworks that we also just started to mention that are appearing over Scotland, and then finishing by tying it back into the archaeology strategy and perhaps that wider view again. So without further ado, I'll ask Helen to come up and speak.
Thanks very much, Jeff. So I'm going to be talking a wee bit about what's been happening recently and some of our recent projects. And then later on, just after lunch, I'll be looking very much more at the evaluations that have already been mentioned a few times, and then where that's leading us over the next at least 4 years, but potentially looking to the future as well. So we've heard a lot already about how the ScARF project came to be and the launch of the national and the first thematic framework. So following this, a key development in archaeology in Scotland was the launch of Scotland's archaeology strategy, now back in 2016. So the tagline for that was very much, we want Scotland to be a place where archaeology is for everyone and to make archaeology matter. And we're now just over halfway through this original 10-year strategy. One of the things that's been said to me before is that the strategy may not have come into being without the process of ScARF happening in the first place. In Scotland, it brought so many people together, and like Simon was talking, the systemic issues and sort of methodological issues that were raised led to people getting together to create, well, what's Scotland's Strategic Archaeology Committee and Scotland's Archaeology Strategy. And the strategy has been very successful at bringing people together across the sector. And we're quite unique in Scotland, having such a clearly defined strategy for archaeology, which fits into our other sort of national heritage strategies, such as Our Place in Time and the wider heritage framework. So this infographic here comes from the 5-year review of the archaeology strategy, which was last year. And you can see some facts and figures. So things like over £6 million has been spent by HES with archaeology strategy projects, of which, of course, ScARF projects and the regional frameworks are included. Figures like 100,000 people have participated in over 400 events as part of Scotland's Archaeology Month. There's been 13,000 Heritage Hero Awards awarded, and nearly 3,500 downloads of our own society publication about Port Mahomet, which is open access on the website. And this is from 2021, so all these figures are likely to be higher than this by now. So how does ScARF fit in with this strategy? Well, the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland has been responsible for Aim 2 of the strategy since its inception, and Aim 2 being to enhance understanding. And it's clearly ScARF is very important in this respect. Simon previously sat on the Strategic Archaeology Committee, and I've been on it since 2019. So talking about not only ScARF projects, but other ways to increase understanding of archaeology in Scotland. Hopefully most of you here will have seen these publications. If not, check out the Scotland Archaeology Strategy website. We've been publishing annual magazines, I think, since 2018. They were originally nice hard copy glossy magazines, but obviously with COVID, the past few editions have been PDF only, but available to download. And they're a great summary of archaeological work across the sector in Scotland. The 2022 version is out very soon. We've got a few technical hitches with our website at the moment, but it will be out there very, very shortly. And every magazine does have a short update on Aim 2, enhancing understanding, and the work of the ScARF project, as well as lots of other work ongoing across Scotland. So for ScARF, our main focus for the past 5 years has been updating the original national framework from 2012. There was lots of conversations back in 2016, 2017, so before my time in the project, so forgive me if I get things wrong. But the discussions and conversations that were had within the sector decided that the best way to update the national picture would be through a series of regional research framework projects, of which the Perth and Kinross Archaeological Research Framework is the latest to be launched just in September. The map shows where we have projects which are either complete or have started, and we currently have an application in for a project to start in the Clyde Valley region, so hopefully we'll be able to start that in 2023. And these regional frameworks are very much designed to update the national picture, but also add much more detail, much more nuance, better tailored to the local region, the concerns in the local region for heritage, and tailored much more also to the planning and development control in the local region. And we're going to be hearing much more details about 3 of these projects this morning. So RAFA was the first regional research framework to be completed, led by Kilmartin Museum. And this consisted of a symposium initially funded by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in 2015. And then with subsequent support from HES and Argyll and Bute Council, amongst others, the main project started, managed by Sharon Webb, the director of Kilmartin Museum. And the notes from the symposium were sent out for consultation, and further meetings were held with specialists approached to set up working groups, so similar to the way the national ScARF was managed. And the period chapters were written by the specialists with an overall editor who helped bring the thing together. And put onto the website by the ScARF team, which was Emma Riordan back in that time. It was published online at the end of 2017, and it's been instrumental in the region, particularly the museum collections have got recognition status, national recognition status. It's helped to make the case for significant funding to build the new museum, which is currently under construction, and it's inspired a lot of new research in the region. The next to be completed was HighArf in the Highlands, managed by Archaeology for communities in the Highlands. And this was very much a community-led process with a community organisation leading. This launched online in September 2012, and I won't say anything more about this because we'll be hearing from Susan shortly. The ScARF, so South East of Scotland Archaeological Research Framework, was initially a 2-year project which ran from 2017 to 2019. And this was led by the South East Scotland Archaeology Partnership, which is essentially the local planning archaeologists across the Edinburgh, Lothian and the border regions. The work itself was contracted to Wessex Archaeology, and they managed to assess lots of the data in the region, from data on the HERs to environmental data, radiocarbon data, bringing things together. And they also completed some basic drafts for the research framework. But the relatively short timescale of this project and the end of the project funding, as well as COVID coming on sort of straight after, have meant that this project hasn't been fully completed yet. So all the chapters need a bit more work with a bit more detail, and the research questions themselves particularly need to be refined. And I've been working recently with the local archaeologists in the region to kickstart this project. And I know there's some of you in the audience today who've been contacted quite recently to ask if you would be willing to help, particularly with peer review and work on some of the chapters. And we're hoping to have some events for this project early next year, and hope to start adding certainly the prehistory sections to the website in 2023. So PCARF, managed by Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust, so a local heritage trust who also act to provide the local authority with historic environment advice and maintain the HER and advise on planning. And we're going to be hearing from David shortly about some aspects of this project. Like I said, it was launched in September this year, so our newest addition to our site. And the final regional project we're working on at the moment is ScARF, the 3 islands, so Scotland's Island Research Framework for Archaeology, which is the Western Isles, Shetland and Orkney, led by the UHI, and working closely with the local archaeologists on the islands. Originally envisaged as a 4-year project, the idea was to spend a year focusing on each island group and then a final year to bring it all together. And the project started in 2018 with a couple of pauses with COVID, and also our project manager, Becky, on maternity leave for a while as well. We're now hoping to sort of finish that, but we're going to have our final symposium in Orkney in March next year, and then sort of finish off the project by 2024. So other things we've been working on since 2012 ScARF. So hopefully most of you have seen our new website. We launched our New Look website back in 2020. So this maintained the original content, but it now has a scope to do so much more. So those of you who can remember the old website, it was very text heavy. They had few images. Due to various sort of practical issues, including lack of continual staffing for the ScARF project over the period of time after 2012. We weren't very in control of the tech side or hosting of the website, and it was very difficult to update it and improve it to bring it up to sort of modern standards. So we started afresh. So we were pleased to have completed the redesign of how it looked, which, like I say, launched at middle of 2020. But crucially, it now also sits on a platform that we're going to be hearing about later this afternoon. We're in control now of what we can do with it, and it's got lots of things we are going to be able to do in future to help, as we talked about, keeping it up to date, to add new information to it. In 2021, we had record views of over 100,000 views of our website, so it is being used more and more than ever before. And ScARF has also continued its work to help more about, continued its work to help create more research in Scotland, help people to carry out research. We're very much, I think, a conduit for people in the sector to find out about projects, to hear about what's going on. We continue to provide student and early career bursaries to enable people to attend conferences and events. And since the start of COVID, we've also additionally covered costs of research, which have been caused by the pandemic. And often we link up with particular conferences as well to support students attending. So, for example, we've supported a number of students to attend TAG in Edinburgh later this year, and the Association of Environmental Archaeologists meeting in Glasgow, I think either the end of this month or beginning of December, probably next weekend, actually. And we've also organised and hosted a range of skills workshops over the years. Very much people need the skills to be able to do research, and we're not just talking about professionals within the sector, but people, amateur researchers, and people who are interested in their heritage of their region. So we've organised a range of skills workshops from osteology, prehistoric pottery, museums, collections management, conservation, all designed to give people some of the skills to carry out research and to encourage them particularly to carry out research on collections that may have been overlooked for many years in stores. And it is a theme that comes out in all of our research frameworks, is that there is huge potential out there, not in the ground, but in museums, that could help answer many of these research questions if we have the time and resources available to do so. So that's all I'm going to say for now. I am going to talk much more about the future and things at just the start of the afternoon session. So we're going to hear a little bit more detail now about each of our recent regional research framework projects, and then also the perspectives of people who use and work with the ScARF resource. Like I say, sadly, Julie's unable to be with, so we don't have as many speakers in this session as originally planned, but I hope this will still leave us with plenty of time for discussion before lunch.
Thanks very much. A little bit to start with about who I am and where we're from, because we were very much an oddball coming into the ScARF project. We're a community group, and we're an educational charity formed in 2009, basically trying to encourage people to find out about their past. And to me, this seems so obvious that this should be part of the ScARF project. So we have a very much of a grassroots and a regional focus. So the ScARF, Highland Regional ScARF, we put up our hand to deal with the Highlands at one of the meetings there. And we started 2018, it went to 2021, September is when we launched. And we started like so much before, like the National ScARF had, like RARFA had, we started with a symposium in 2018, basically inviting people to give us a snapshot of what they thought was known, but also getting people to contribute to what they thought were the gaps. And you can see the post-its on, the low-tech post-its on the wall to try to get people to identify. We actively invited as many people as we could. We have over 100, about 100 local societies in the Highlands. We have over 50 museums and archives, trying to get as many of those to participate. The Highland Council Historic Environment team were put in as our partners right from the start. And so that was very useful for us. They did a lot of in-kind support. They also meant for us having the Highland Council area simplify things so much more. ScARF had this difficulty of trying to combine 3 local authorities, 3 different HERs, 3 different data. We were just a unity, and that made it just so much easier. The big challenge we faced was not expected, and of course, we were a lockdown project. And I agonized about this, as I'm trying to finish the writing up, thinking, I have no access to libraries. How on earth am I going to do this? And then I just realized I should just turn this on its head. It's a lockdown project. You put it out there, and the whole point of ScARF is to get people to respond. So if there are any errors, if there's any things we should be adding, this hopefully will be the kick to get people to get involved. You don't have to read this, but the point of the whole slide is just to show this is not a single person project. So many people were involved, so many people, and I haven't even listed at the bottom all the people who responded to email inquiries. So what's in HighArf? Well, we took the decision to go chronological so that it would be the same as the national and RARFA. We also included, however, a large number of data sheets, and we included a large number of case studies so that people who wanted to find out about it could take those bite-sized chunks if they wanted to. So our chapters, as I said, were more or less to correspond to what had gone before. I mean, there's been no continuity totally in this. RARFA had already gone off on its own way as well. So we aimed for something that hopefully people could read national, they could read RARFA, they could then see where they could look into the Highland story for that. We also made the decision to try to have a common structure for every single chapter, so that if somebody was interested in something that went across a number of periods, they would be able to go in the same place within each of the individual chronological periods. And this is the scheme we came up. Whether it was successful or not, I leave that to you, but I think it was one of the things I found a bit difficult with national, is trying to take from one chapter, one chronology, and try to apply that to another. So what was different about HighArf than had gone before? I mean, I suppose the main one, our focus right from day one, was to see how we could involve more people. We wanted to see as many volunteering opportunities that we could get people out there. The skills workshops Helen was mentioning, we had a number of these just to try to get people so that they felt they had the skills then to contribute as well. We actively asked people to contribute right throughout. Lots of the case studies are written by other people who just had a passion, and they have put that in. And we did a large number of public talks just to try to get the word out about what was happening and get people interested to look locally as well. We deliberately aimed it at a wide range of readers. I think you could say that from the national, it was perhaps more tipped towards the academic audience. And we were really keen that this one would be available to everyone. So yes, academics and researchers, but we also wanted general readers. People who were just interested in what was happening in the Highlands. What about those community groups who have projects and want to know how to put their local heritage into context? Tour guides. I mean, tourism is a big one, and the best, if you can get actual accurate information into tour guides' heads, this is a really good thing to do. Obviously, museums. As I say, we have 50 museums, 50 plus museums. This is a good standpoint to have this overview. The commercial units who are working there, it's a good thing for them as well to know what's been done and what the context is. And you could go on for the different people that we were trying to go. Were we successful? I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, and perhaps I'd be interested to pull this up in the discussion. I think we haven't been for a lot of these other groups, and I think that is a basis for discussion on how we get the word out that ScARF is there. First thing we did, the other thing that was really different for us is we focused on the data, realizing that what you come out with is only as good as much the information that you know. Now, clearly we weren't going to get everything, but it seemed to me that we had a fairly good basis on our sites and our buildings by using Canmore and the Highland HER. But what we didn't know, and what hadn't really been integrated, was information about finds. All those finds were there. And so I contacted the 50-plus museums, and I visited a good proportion of them to try to find out information about their collections. We asked for access to museum catalogs. There are some museums that are still not even on digital. There was certainly, but those who are trying to get access to some of their catalogs, there's only 2 online catalogs of all those Highland museums that I could access from the office. So we also found, as well as we were doing this, that there's a huge backlog. Most museums are volunteer-led, and so there's a huge backlog on getting the information into the systems they have. And so we had volunteering opportunities. And we were regularly, for example, a group volunteering at Inverness Museum to try to clear up a lot of their backlog and get those on. We got the information from Treasure Trove, which was still, at that point, well, I think to a certain degree it still is, in bits and pieces, and trying to pull all the information of Treasure Trove allocations. And we were very lucky that the National Museum of Scotland agreed to download their catalogue to us. So we were able to get all the finds, and there are thousands of them, from the Highlands that are down here in Edinburgh. So to get all that information about finds, but then the key was to get that into the public domain. There's no point getting it into us. We've got to get it back. And so in the first instance, we fed this into the HER. Grace, who's sitting here, had the big task of trying to get all this information and get that information in. And the screen picture there is an HER entry about metal detecting finds from Cromarty. And you can see just that huge bit of information that wasn't known about before. The idea was to hopefully get that, and then once it's in the HER, there's talks now about linking Canmore to link to the HER records. At the moment, HER links to Canmore, but Canmore does not link to the HER. The data sheets, as we were compiling all this information, we put them into data sheets, knowing that this would be of information to a lot of researchers, and we deliberately put them into Excel spreadsheets, so whoever takes these can use them and sort them in whatever they want. We tried to get every single radiocarbon date that we knew of in the Highlands. I'm sure we're missing lots of them, but we still had over 1,600, and that's now finally in one place. All the treasure trove allocations that we tracked down in one place. Where are the locations of human remains? This now, with of course the ADNA and all the other things, this is a major lack of knowledge beforehand. And then of course we did thematic as well. So these data sheets can be downloaded, they can be added to, and they need to be added to already, even so it was only 2 years ago that we've had. But also, it's a way that other people could contribute into data sheets as well. So key lessons. What have we taken away from this? Well, first thing I think is data. You can make fantastic maps. You can make fantastic discussion, but if you don't have your data, there's no point. And so it really is to try to think about getting as much of that data there and to get that into the public domain, making it available. It was amazing how much of the information is still not published. Almost so many sites are still as data structure reports. We're very lucky that the Highland HER puts data structure reports onto their records. Without that, this could not have been done. But it's also really worrying that so much of these, even key sites we're talking about, are still in data structure reports. Usually those data structure reports were written before any post-excavation analysis was done. And then the actual report with the post-excavation analysis is rarely submitted back there. And there are some key sites that we know are completely unpublished. This, to me, was a real eye-opening finding here, is that, in a sense, we're losing so much data by not having this information get put back and into the public domain. Having a public project officer, essential. This is too big a task for one person. We, like everybody else, tried to get our experts in Scotland to discuss this, and some of these are getting quite tired about being asked, the contributor fatigue. Richard Tipping told me in no short measure that he had done his bit, and yeah, he had, hadn't he? So in a sense, it's something we need to address for the regional frameworks that we did and what's coming. The way we approached this was to say, okay, let's write something, send it to them, and hope that they'll read it. And some people did, and some people didn't, but that was a way to get around this, to hopefully make it less. But at the same time, any contributor that you do have, you need to feed them the data. They have a good overview, but a lot of these people who work on the national scale don't know about the local sites. And that's where the data sheets and the references to the DSRs come into it. It is possible to involve organizations, museums, and individuals. This was a finding that was no surprise to me, but it did seem to be a surprise to some of the others. I know ScARF at the beginning struggled, and just in the end said, well, people aren't interested. That's not true. They are interested, you just have to approach them in the right way. I also, and this was quite interesting what was said before, I also thought this was ideal dissertation topics. Get them to take ownership. You were talking about that, Jeff. I was completely unsuccessful in that. And it's something I think has a real potential for the ScARFs, is to get students to actually do research that can get that even just as a case study and gives them a sense of ownership in it as well and gets them using it. Recognizing the amount of time involved, that will come out in every single one of these. There's no surprise there. So all I can say to finish off with this very nice graphic that Leanne did for us for the ScARF one, it was a real privilege to be able to work on the Highland Archaeology Research Framework, to actually pull together finally an overview of such an interesting area. And it's terrific, and thank you to HES, thank you to Society of Antiquaries of Scotland for enabling this to be done. Thank you.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, my name's Rebecca Rennell. I'm the project coordinator for ScARF, which is Scotland's Island Research Framework for Archaeology. So in this very short presentation, I'm going to try and achieve three things. I'm just going to introduce you to ScARF. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the rationale for a three-island approach, why we think an island approach is appropriate, why we hope it will make a useful and meaningful contribution to the regional research framework agenda, and also how it fits in and complements the national framework that we're obviously all celebrating today. I'll then talk a little bit about our achievements to date. Slightly concerned that everyone's talking about being really tough and toughing it through COVID, and I'm afraid I wimped out, so I'll come to that. I'm very impressed with everybody else. And then finally, I'm going to pitch for and try and promote our forthcoming symposium in Orkney, which you've already heard about. Okay. So ScARF is coordinated by UHI Archaeology Institute staff, it's basically myself, at UHI at Hebrides, but we're in partnership with the local authority archaeologists, and I think that's quite an important part of this project. So we work with the archaeologists at Corlia, Rennell and Shear, the West Isles Council, Shetland Community Trust, and also at Orkney Islands Council. We're also, obviously, like all of the other regional research frameworks, we're supported by the Society of Antiquaries and by ScARF, and also by Algeo. And, of course, we're also funded by Historic Environment Scotland as part of Scotland's archaeology strategy. So, our approach. Our approach is really multi-scalar. It's evolved from lots of discussions that we've had about the way in which national and regional frameworks articulate. But for us, because we're working in three regions, we have a sort of additional scale. And that one is the three-island framework. But then sitting within this, there are the individual island frameworks, so one for each of our local authority areas. So that's the Outer Hebrides, for Orkney, and for Shetland. And finally, because we work and we live in islands, and we think about islands a lot, we argue that there needs to be another scale, and that's the islands within islands. Move on. So we all know this, I'm pointing out the very obvious, but these groups of island regions are in fact archipelagos. So as an example, today the Outer Hebrides or the West Isles, I use those terms interchangeably, and I'm very aware that I shouldn't, and I need to make a decision about which way we were going to go for this framework. So I'm still playing around with both. I'm happy to have people's opinion on that. But yeah, we have 15 inhabited islands currently. But in an archaeological perspective, we've got 50 individual islands within that archipelago that have evidence for archaeological remains of one form or another. So we need to think about that. We need to think about these as a group of islands. We also need to think about islands within islands. We observe that there's a tendency amongst some researchers to make slight islands of themselves in the way that they work. And the result of this can be slightly isolated narratives. I can think of a few that come to mind. For example, St Kilda. We talked about that a lot while we were doing the CVI. The Shants, or even larger islands such as North Uist and South Uist. So as part of our framework, we've been exploring and questioning the validity of these isolated research strategies and encouraging our stakeholders to think about inter-island projects and opportunities. We also recognise that islands are often liminal. They link different regions, so they can be the connecting point between regional and national frameworks. Another example here from the Scilly Isles. The Scilly Isles has a research framework which links with the research frameworks in the English Southwest, but also with Northern France and Wales and Ireland. So I've looked at that framework as sort of guidance for how we could do similar things with connecting into Ireland and other Atlantic and North Sea contacts. So why have we decided to lump all these three together? So there are clearly periods where archaeologically research to date highlights similar characteristics, shared aspects of material culture, and where there's evidence that kind of points to these strong links and communication. But equally, we can all probably point to examples and periods where archaeological research indicates the exact opposite. So places where we have distinct narratives, we have cultures and societies that seemingly are isolated from one another across these regions. Furthermore, it sounds like I'm talking myself out of a three-line research, but I'll come back to why in a sec. We also know that there are varying and different relationships between the islands and the mainland, and that those relationships vary over time and vary between the island groups. So we need to be really mindful and really sensitive to these dynamics when we're thinking about a research framework for the three island groups. And I just want to be really clear to say that we're not overlooking potential differences just by looking at these areas together. But our rationale is that islands, specifically small islands and island groups, present some really distinct challenges as well as opportunities from a research perspective. And furthermore, we think that there's a real value in thinking about and approaching island research slightly differently from how we think about mainland research. I'm going to talk about some of these. So we've got a couple of challenges that are worth pointing out. Firstly, our islands environmentally are quite vulnerable, and many of the research opportunities within these places require quite urgent attention. Things such as rising sea levels, increased storminess, coastal erosion. These present huge challenges for management of archaeological resources, but also research and conservation. This is not a uniquely island phenomena. However, if we look to the fantastic SCAPE project, the SCAPE Trust and the SHARP project, 322 high-priority archaeology sites in Scotland, and 2/3 of these are located in the North and Western Isles. I've got an image here that's showing some work that we did with UHI students, recording a huge coastally eroding settlement at Kirstagruig in Balashar. The point really is just that coastal erosion and the vulnerability of these islands are really central to the way that we think about archaeology and archaeological research. I also want to put forward the idea that in modern terms, arguably our islands can be perceived as quite remote. We're at a distance from political and administrative centres, and when islands are the subject of research, this brings with them a range of additional accessibility and resource challenges. So in short, I'm talking about additional travel, staff, and equipment costs, and these need to be thought about when we think about research. But perhaps I would argue more importantly, this physical and perceived kind of disconnect between islands and the mainland, these kind of urban centres, can serve to separate the research locales, so the islands, from researchers who are often based somewhere else, and the research outputs, which also often remain somewhere else. So some more positives. We don't just have challenges, we have loads of really great opportunities for research. Again, none of these are absolutely unique to islands, but I think that in their totality, there are things that we can talk about within an island context. So we've got really exceptional preservation across all three areas, partly because of a relative lack of development. So we've got lots more remains that remain undisturbed. We've also got lots of traditional land management practices, such as crofting, for example, and these are less damaging to upstanding structures. But we've also got these fantastic environments like peat bogs and macha in absolute abundance, so preservation is fantastic. So the things that I'm pointing people here to are the potential for underwater archaeology, submerged landscape studies, maritime adaptation activities and technology research. And we've got a lovely picture here from my colleague Scott Timpany, and this is volunteers from UHI working with Scott to record a submerged woodland at Linnaclit. Again, everyone will know this better than I do, but archaeological research not only informs us about the past, but it also informs the present and really helps us define the future. The Scottish Islands have some specific characteristics that we need to think about. Like many of the world's islands, the Scottish Islands are vulnerable to population decline. We've got issues that relate to limited employment, education and training opportunities, low relative income, poor housing, and lots of other core infrastructure problems. These issues are recognised at national level in Scotland's Islands Bill and the Our Islands, Our Future initiative. They're also recognised at a European level with Article 174 of the Lisbon Treaty and by UNESCO. So we argue with our framework that we need to be mindful, really mindful to the impact of archaeological research on contemporary island communities. And in order to do that, we need to take account of the particular characteristics of islands within our modern world. So all those three things, Scotland's Island Bill, Article 174 and UNESCO, they're all in agreement that for islands, heritage and local culture are key assets. And this is perhaps most obvious when we start thinking about tourism, building and sustaining local heritage-based tourism. An example that I repeat frequently to our local council is that Orkney Islands Council has an annual budget for supporting archaeological research. And they do this not because they necessarily just love archaeology research, it's because there is a demonstrable return on this investment through heritage-based tourism. I don't think that I can say that enough to our local council. Another example, again, from Orkney, who do this so well, the most recent Visit Scotland surveys indicate that 69% of leisure visitors to Orkney visit at least one archaeological site. However, it's not just tourism by any means. Research can have a really positive and long-lasting impacts for local communities and island communities in terms of social identity. And I've put this photo up because I think it's a great example of that kind of project. This is a Digit-sponsored project taken at the Ring of Brodgar for World Heritage Day, Glow in the Archaeo Dark project. I wasn't there, I don't know if anyone was, but it's something that I've always looked at as being a really great example of that kind of work. And as I think I've already implied, research can also help inform island communities about how to build a resilient, confident and sustainable future. So that's the justification for why we're looking at 3 islands together. Hopefully I've made a good enough case for that. So back to the project itself. What exactly have we done so far? We're in the sort of present section, aren't we? Rather than we should probably be hovering between the present and the future section because we haven't completed. The project started in July 2018. Like many of the others, it's structured around a series of symposium events hosted in each of the island areas. So we ran the first of our events in January in 2019 in North Uist. I still look back on that and wonder what the hell I was thinking arranging a conference for January. I can't quite remember what was going through my mind, but anyway, we did it and we managed to pull it off, which was remarkable. But we got everybody there, so that was good. It was a really successful event, in fact. And although a few people did have trouble getting there, we managed to get people all the way over from the States. And the only delegate who was delayed and couldn't get there till the next day was actually the local authority archaeologist who got trapped in Stornoway and couldn't, because of weather, not for any other weird reason. I realised I made that sound a bit odd. But yeah, so that was actually a really successful event. And later on that year, we went to Shetland in Lerwick, and that was also really great. And then this is where I have to say, instead of, toughing through like everybody else, the project took an 18-month break, partly because I went on maternity leave and had a lockdown baby, and that was stressful enough. But I really felt that I couldn't do justice to our sort of next stage, which was to be running our Orkney Symposium through lockdown. So I wimped out. So we've taken a bit of a break. We've resumed that this year. And then in 2023, we will have our final event in Orkney. So I've already said that we've structured around these research events, these research symposia. We open this to a really wide range of stakeholders. We, like the other regional research frameworks we've heard about, we wanted to get as wide a view as possible, and we wanted people to tell us what they thought the research gaps and priorities should be. And essentially, the output will be a culmination of all these people's viewpoints. The Western Isles and the Shetland Symposium both included between 70 and 80 people, and I was really pleased that we got really good representation from all different sectors. So it wasn't just academic, we had commercial, we had lots of community members and museum staff and lots of local authority input. There's just some pictures from that event. So we divide, again, like the others, we take the chronological framework from the national framework, from ScARF, for all the obvious reasons that everybody else did, because we want this to be a complementary piece of work. But we also introduced, again, like others, some themes. And these themes came out of some consultation with various people at a UHI conference in Orkney in 2017. And we came up with these. Connections and insularity, I think, is a particularly important and arguably quite an island-specific one. We're really interested in exploring, challenging some of these themes here about remoteness, migration, insularity, interconnectedness, and colonisation. I think the other ones possibly speak for themselves, so I won't go through them. The way that we structured our work is that in advance of all these events, we invite and encourage stakeholders, whether they're attending the event or not, we get them to submit some questions online through this sort of survey, JISC surveys. We ask people to identify research gaps, and we ask them to frame them as research questions. And if they can, associate them with a theme or a period, but they don't have to. And then all of these questions, regardless of who submitted them, they can be submitted anonymously or not. Everybody's voice is just as valid. All of these questions go forward and get discussed in our discussion groups at the symposium. So, in theory, an agreement comes out of these meetings by all the participants on what these key research gaps are and suggested ways forward. But I cannot emphasize enough, and there'll be a reason why, how important this part of the process is, because I want you all to take part. So, the outputs. We are doing things a little bit differently from some of the other regional frameworks. I argue that we are really lucky to have some excellent summaries of existing archaeological knowledge for our island regions, whether that's in dedicated books, as summary sections in some of the recent excavation monographs, really good pieces of work there, HES publications, but of course the ScARF panel reports themselves. So that's why we've made the decision that we're not going to have chapters, we're not going to have a kind of lengthy narrative style in our framework. Instead, we're focusing on clarifying these research gaps and articulating them as clear questions. And I think also, I sometimes worry, wonder whether that was the right or the wrong decision. And then I think again about that phrase that Susan just used about contributor fatigue, and we would only be another level in that. Right, just a few little details about some of the events so far. We had 80 delegates in the Western Isles, we had 4 field trips, 6 period and thematic workshops, public talks, and also a session that that we didn't necessarily know was going to be so popular, but we ran this community, we called it a community engagement session. And here we were asking specifically members of the Western Isles community to come forward and say, what did they want us to study as archaeologists? And a recurring theme that came out of it. It was quite a tense session, but it was really, really rich in terms of information that came forward. But there were a couple of things. But the benefits of archaeological research for our communities was a recurring theme. And we're going to write that up soon. Perhaps as something separate, in fact. Similarly, we took a very similar structure for the Shetland Symposium. We had 73 delegates, again, field trips, workshops, public talks. And here we focused on a slightly different topic. As a sort of add-on was the art and archaeology session, working with some local artists and hosted by Antonia Thomas. And again, evening reception in Cady. And we did this fantastic trip out to Musa, which was, was one of the best experiences. So across these 2 events, the outcomes have been 143 responses to online surveys. We've got 12 in total of these workshops, 28 different session chairs, 70 hours of workshop recordings. I'm looking to Mari over there who's going through them at the moment, and 15,000 words of notes. We've also had 13 students and early career researchers who got bursaries through the Society of Antiquaries for travel and accommodation. Also, a major part of this project has been the resource assessments. This is to establish current knowledge and understanding for the regions. We've completed these for the Western Isles and for Shetland. We haven't even started for Orkney. That's how far behind we are. We've employed 3 project research assistants. Through that process so far, 147 individuals or organisations have been contacted or consulted. We've got this huge mailing list, and we've got these 2 really robust resource assessment databases, which are geo-referenced and pull together things from the HER and from Canmore. And we've had lots of challenges in rationalising that, as I'm sure everyone else had. I'm sure you can imagine, so I don't need to go into details. Another real success to the project time, I'm almost at the end. 2 more slides. Another key success has been contribution from staff. So we've employed, as I said, 3 people. I won't go into too much detail then, but working with early career researchers who have all contributed and worked actively in the islands. We've had Emily Gow working with us quite early on, and her PhD was about Orkney material, Samantha Dennis, who lives and works in Shetland, and very recently, Mari, who's over at the back of the room over there, who's just started working on the ScARF project and is going to submit her PhD really soon with Glasgow University. So, really great team. So, as I've mentioned, we paused the project, but now we're coming back from the dead, and Orkney Symposium will be this March. These are the dates. Please note them. You would all be very welcome. 24th of March to the 27th of March in Kirkwall. We're just working out the venue at the moment, and I'm in the process of contacting chairs to ask if they'd like to be involved. There'll be field trips. There'll be great social events. It'll be fabulous, so please get involved. And finally, just come back to these survey questions. Even if you can't come, don't want to come, whatever, please will you engage with this part of the process. It's really, really important to us because it lays the sort of framework for all those debates that we have in person. And ultimately, the questions and whether they will or won't get included will come down to the discussions, but we'd really value your inclusion in that. Thank you very much.
It's a great privilege for me to speak today at the 10-year celebration of ScARF. For the last few years, I've had the honour of chairing the Scottish Archaeology Committee, where I've seen firsthand the excellent work and the outcomes undertaken by the ScARF team and the partners, led so well by, of course, Helen. That ScARF is now acknowledged across the sector and upheld as a model that European partners want to base their own countries' research frameworks on, as we've heard, shows the total value of ScARF. For such a small team to manage and harness the expertise of scores of difficult archaeologists with diverse backgrounds, opinions and attitudes is truly a remarkable achievement, and it's completely right we are here today celebrating their achievements today. In my lecture, I've been asked to talk about, give my perspective of ScARF from an applied archaeology perspective. Thus, I'm standing before you wearing another hat, the Managing Director of AOC Archaeology, the longest established commercial archaeology company in Scotland, and now one of the largest privately owned commercial archaeology companies in the UK. When I started running AOC 13 years ago, when I had hair, our sector was known as commercial archaeology, but now, because of Ian Ralston, now known as the applied archaeology sector. This is because every day AOC, CFA, Headland, Wessex, Guard, Rubicon, and scores of other units apply the principles of archaeology across Scotland. We are the ones undertaking hundreds of archaeological projects in every region of our nation on a daily basis, testing ideas, training new graduates, and undertaking innovative research and development. Together, we employ more practicing archaeologists than all public and third sector heritage organisations put together. This is a crucial fact. It's the simple truth that the collective group undertaking the most active archaeological research and development on a daily basis in terms of quantity across Scotland is the applied sector. Thus, it surely goes without saying that the applied sector should be the biggest end users of ScARF. As I said at the start of my talk, I wholeheartedly support ScARF, but want to spend the next 10 minutes highlighting three key areas that, in my view, need to be addressed if we're going to derive the full value of ScARF, particularly the emerging regional frameworks now and into the future. My first issue is to do with future implementation and direction, which I guess we'll talk about this afternoon. In 2012, the president of the Society of Antiquaries, the late, great Roger Mercer, who we've heard, made the following statement regarding ScARF, and it's still on the website. The last sentence is key for me, enabling future research to be appropriately and economically directed. By definition, directing is the management or guidance of someone or something. So I am the managing director of AOC, and it's my job to manage and direct 170 staff. By definition, there is someone at the helm directing or steering the ship, helped by a suite of regional managers and champions. So given the most active research is undertaken by the applied sector, we really need to answer who's directing the future research and use of ScARF. I've never bought into the convenient view that plans, strategies, and frameworks are for everyone. The subtext that everyone owns it and can therefore direct and implement their own approaches as they choose. In my view, that way lies chaos, and surely wasn't what Roger meant. If we truly want future research to be appropriately and economically directed, then someone or something has to be steering the ScARF ship, particularly the emerging regional frameworks, into the future waters. Otherwise, we will all be paddling down the Forth in individual ships having no collective direction. Undoubtedly, lots of people will produce good work, but the collective effort will be diluted, and many ships will probably sink on the journey. So a key question for me is, who's steering the ScARF ship, making sure the regional frameworks are being implemented? You, me, Helen, the individual archaeologists on site, curators, the lead framework authors, the society, the people who pay for the archaeological work? Who is it? Although some applied archaeology is linked to nationally significant monuments, protected by legislation and designation, most of our work takes place on undesignated sites. Thus, the overwhelming majority of day-to-day applied archaeology sits firmly within the regional planning system. It doesn't take place in Edinburgh, and it's not administered from Edinburgh. This is a critical point in our considerations of how future Scottish research is appropriately and economically directed, both intellectually and financially. Regional curators are the gatekeepers who direct the overwhelming majority of our daily work. They review and sign off on the ways hundreds of applied archaeologists approach researching, directing, excavating, recording, and publishing archaeological work. And their job is only becoming more and more difficult, as this graph shows. After the launch of ScARF in 2012, the UK archaeological sector increased by 20% and completely out of kilter with a number of local curators. Yes, individual museum curators, university professors, and community groups can undoubtedly self-police their own research digs, but what's the structure for the other scores of archaeologists working across Scotland every day of the week? I'm not convinced this critical issue was who is to direct the use of ScARF after it was launched was actually considered during the initial deliberations. Only 20% of the 2012 steering group was actually linked in any way to the inevitable end users, that is, the applied archaeologists, the biggest sector that would always use the end product. The steering group appears to have been set up more to direct the academic philosophy of ScARF. Now, this is completely understandable during the vision phase, but was any consideration given to who were the actual gatekeepers who were literally going to direct the future of ScARF after it moved into the implementation phase a decade later? I'm in no way saying it is now up to regional curators to direct the use of ScARF, merely raising the issue for discussion today. I'm not convinced we currently know the answer. My second issue is to do with updates. In 2012, again, the instigators of ScARF made this statement. It is important that the outcome be seen in that spirit as an interim statement. The work of revision, updating, and if necessary, contradiction must begin immediately, thus leading hopefully to a full revision of this text within 5 years. In any given day, there are around 30 applied archaeological jobs undertaken across Scotland, hundreds over a year, all of which generate new data. Who's going to update these live regional frameworks? The Society of Antiquaries? Overburdened regional curators? Me? You? 2 decades ago, there were screeds of local research frameworks in England, but many have fallen by the wayside, made academically redundant by the lack of live updates. As the archaeology is excavated at pace, how does ScARF keep up? I've already posed the question of who's directing the use of ScARF in the future, particularly on a regional basis, but an equally critical question is, what benchmark are they asking people to follow? There is a real danger in the future that we may be expecting future archaeologists to build the 2025 Star Wars Lego Millennium Falcon with the instructions from the much-loved but now redundant 1970s Lego spaceship. But there's actually a third, more fundamental issue that we need to grapple with if we're going to be directed in the most academic and economically sensible way. Over the last 5 years, a suite of Scottish units, AOC, CFA, Wessex, Headland, Rubicon, have worked on HS2, the largest infrastructure project in the UK. Now, HS2 had an extremely innovative approach to research during the project. Their work demonstrated that research frameworks only work in the most academic and economically sensible way if they are directed, discussed, and assessed on the ground almost every day. As we all know, despite all the best planning in the world, it is only when you strip back the turf that you discover what can be researched. It is a completely iterative process. If you think about all the sites you've seen today, most of them are upstanding and scheduled. You know what they are. That's not real archaeology. We dig it. We have no idea what it is. Now, the iterative process is not a new idea. John Barber once told me that when you dig a site, you must start the day with a research question to answer, but be prepared to have totally new ones by the end of the day. This requires all gatekeepers to engage in the active archaeological programs taking place across Scotland, not just the ones you're interested in or you can travel to. Units have spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on real-time digital data and systems, which now help with directing and interpreting the emerging archaeology in real time. But this can only go so far. The point is this: we shouldn't just construct research questions in a method statement prior to going to site, nor back in a lab during the post-excavation assessment phase. It has to be an iterative discussion in the field, particularly for large-scale linear schemes that cut across multiple landscapes, regions, communities, and time periods, like the A9. And if we do that, our research outputs will be so much better for it. In its first decade, there's been a staggering outputs from ScARF, and we've heard that this morning. And the next few years, as we've seen, we'll see the regional frameworks almost complete. A remarkable achievement by a small band of remarkable people. But we now need to get practical and focus on the end user, which is predominantly applied archaeologists, who are largely directed by local curators. We now need to focus on 3 real practical issues that would make ScARF a continued success, and we can have more birthday cake in 10 years' time. To reiterate my 3 points. First, if we really want regional frameworks to work, then we need an honest discussion about the future directors' steering group of ScARF. I would argue the original steering group did a fantastic job of creating the academic baseline, but it now needs to be revamped to consider more appropriate ScARF champions, and those centred on the end users who will be using ScARF the most. This is not a simple case of just saying, over to you, AOC, or any applied archaeologist should dig what they want on a daily basis. The real planning world is far more complicated than that. So who are the future directors and steering groups? Where are the regional managing directors of ScARF? Second, there needs to be a far more honest discussion of who's updating these frameworks on a monthly, yearly basis. What's the current plan? If we don't have one, we need one soon. Otherwise, the frameworks will become redundant and unused in the coming years. Third, if you truly want to reach Roger's aspiration of enabling future research to be appropriately and economically directed, then the sector needs to embrace iterative, real-time discussions of emerging data, particularly on upcoming large-scale schemes, not in a post-excavation laboratory or in a First Millennium Studies group 2 years hence. So what's the answer? I've lived through multiple attempts to change the way archaeology is administered through local and national systems, and my view has been entirely consistent. There is nothing wrong with the current system, it just needs far more capacity and newer, joined-up, innovative thinking across our often disparate sectors. If we really are committed to making ScARF work on a practical level, not just something that sits on a website or is lauded as a good idea used by a select few, then the sector needs to address the fundamental issues I have raised. If the Society of Antiquaries, the steering group, and the funders really want future research to be appropriately and economically directed, then they need to actively engage with the majority of people who direct and deliver the research across Scotland on a daily basis. Put short, if we want regional research, we need to dramatically expand the regional support network and help the amazing local curators that we currently have. I'm not saying that this is the model, but at least it's a starter for 10. Thank you.
Cool. So are there any kind of questions to kick us off? And if you do have a question, please wait for the microphone so that our attendees online can hear you.
Hello, thank you very much. Really, really fascinating talks. I hope you don't mind me asking this, and I'll say I'm in some ways a little bit of an outsider because my training's as a historian, but I was involved in the Perthick-Ross research framework. And I've still really got two questions I'd be really interested in the panel's perspective on. One is how we could enhance dialogue with history going forwards, because I'm conscious that actually, there's a lot of questions that people were talking about in relation to archaeology, which historians are also debating, but we're not actually having the same conversation necessarily. And to give you an awareness of how unaware historians are, I was recently speaking with colleagues and the Institute of Historical Research at St Andrews, and about 50% were unaware of the existence of ScARF altogether, which probably is a negative assessment of St Andrews, but that's where we are. These are all people who are researching Scottish history. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts on dialogue with historians. And the other thing, and I think is a related question, is this massive of publications. You were saying how much was still in data structure reports and things, and sometimes not really published at all in any way. And visions, thoughts on that issue, and if there's any way this can be dealt with, because I think that is one of the reasons why historians are so ignorant about what is going on in archaeology. So, sorry, I hope you don't mind me asking those things.
Who from the panel would like to brave that?
Yeah, well, I agree, obviously, with what you say in terms of the awareness of ScARF. That was one thing that came out of the 2019 evaluation, was lack of awareness of ScARF, sometimes within the sector, but also in these sort of interconnected sectors, you know, that we should be working with more. So that is something that we do want to do, is get the word out about ScARF to as many people as possible. I've got no suggestion about how we deal with all the DSRs. Capacity was the word Andy mentioned, and it is an issue with capacity. So the ScARF project itself, I suppose, had a capacity problem in that after the initial ScARF was launched, you'll put me right on it, but there was a gap for a while where there wasn't sort of project managers or project officers working on ScARF, so there was nobody physically able to update it or continue. And up until very recently, it was only managed by a part-time project manager, you know, up until, I'm only 4 days a week, and I was 3 days a week when I first started the job. So even ScARF itself has got a capacity project, so how we get around, well, hopefully not so much anymore, but the capacity in terms of dealing with the backlog. Yeah, I don't know, Andy's probably got maybe some more ideas, and Susan, but there is such a massive backlog. And having it accessible, and also awareness of people. So I go around lots of universities and talk to students, and I'm amazed sometimes they're in the 3rd and 4th years, and they don't know about sort of OASIS or ADS, or they don't know about some of these structures in the industry of archaeology, which I sort of think, oh, by the time they get to that stage, they would know about these things. So sometimes I'm coming to them for the first time in the 3rd or 4th year, saying, oh, have you heard of ScARF? And it's, oh no. So there's much more of that we can do now as ScARF as well, and working with, you know, history departments and other departments as well as, you know, archaeology.
I think the issue of the missing data is one that I was really taken by. And I don't have the answer, and it's something I think I've passed it up to the Archaeology Strategy Committee, because I think it's something they should be addressing with recommendations. But also, I have this horrible feeling it's probably they're just going to devolve it down to the local authorities. And that's going to be another crunch issue, because there's a capacity issue there. But the importance of this one, I think, can't be just brushed aside. What's the point of doing anything if you don't publish the data? What's the point of digging a site if the company goes bust and you have no idea where the finds are, or you don't know. So many places we don't know where the finds have gone. So I think this is something that has to be addressed. It's not a Highland issue. I think it's a Scotland-wide issue. I don't have the answers, but this would be a good forum later on in the discussion maybe to bring that up again.
Okay. Yeah, actually, we probably should do that because it's actually quite... There's obviously lots of different people who don't publish stuff. I'm one of them. But things like a company, if they get inspected by CIFA, that's the type of thing they ask. So I think we need to, who is it? Is it museums, universities, individuals, that kind of thing? But I think you're right, as a sector, we need to address that. And yeah, that's probably something we should put on the... Becky's not here, is she? Okay. Oh, can we do that? Fine. Okay, let's do that.
Thank you to all the speakers for those stimulating papers, and I guess particularly to Andy, because he laid out so clearly what one of the future challenges is. And maybe this question at this point is redundant, given that we're talking about the future this afternoon. So I'm quite happy to leave it hanging until the afternoon session. But ever since the inception of the strategy, one of the key things we identified that needed to be changed was capacity, and I just wondered, in particular, what Andy thought, given his role on the strategy, where we are with that, and how close are we to being able to change the capacity to increase capacity.
In terms of the wider archaeology sector, or in terms of...
Well, I'm thinking, obviously, in relation to the things that you said, where you identified the need for capacity,
Yeah, I mean,
kind of on the front line, but I don't want to see capacity front-loaded onto the front line, because the things that you were talking about all the time made me think, yeah, but what happens after that, And, and if all that is put right there, what happens? When do the publications appear? How are the finds going to get properly looked after and reassessed in future years?
So, so when as you know, I used to work in the museum, and I guess my head was similar to a lot of the steering group in 2008, 2012, and we reflected on what happened in the industry in the recession and all that, But the reality is, since then, commercial archaeology, applied archaeology, has gone up in the numbers hugely. And that's real, So whether I disagree with the original makeup of the steering group is neither here nor there, but the reality is the people who are doing the overwhelming majority of work now are in the applied sector, and people know this, they don't know this. When we do our work, the method statement is the critical one, signed off by local curators. And that will never change. Yes, we do some work on scheduled monuments, there's national policy, but on my day-to-day job, that's a tiny piece, almost irrelevant. It's local planning authorities. So there's a method statement. So you have this research design. So the logic would be, you write these research questions into the WSI, the Written Scheme of Investigation, Now that's a big enough challenge as it is, but that's entirely possible. But my question is, do I just tell my AOC staff to do that, or the local authority asked me to do that? It's dead easy to solve. But the key bit I was making is you can do this because the HS2 showed it. We had to get publications out and samples done, et cetera, because it's contractually done, et cetera. So I think we need an entirely new conversation about how we get research frameworks written into the standard archaeological practice on a daily basis. And that has to be done through Algeo and people like that. Now, that is not to say that myself and my colleagues don't do research, because we do. I could have whacked lyrical about all the research commercial archaeologists do. But it needs to be that process. The critical thing we learned on HS2 was you're supposed to change your research questions halfway through. And another point which is not very well made is we're all digging nice sites that are upstanding. You can tell it's a hill fort before you go and dig it. You can tell it's a brock before you go and dig it. 99% of the stuff that we do is you're looking at a sand or turf, and you've got some idea from geophysics or potentially some idea from APs. Then when you strip it, it completely changes. So it has to be this iterative process. Now, that's really difficult. saying to Kirsty Cameron, oh, I've got 10 live archaeology projects in the Highland. Can you nip across the Skye, then get across the Western Isles and then up to Caithness by tomorrow? So in my career, I've hated when somebody went, you need more capacity, because it doesn't seem to me, oh, that's an easy cop-out. You need more curatorial capacity on a regional basis to make this work. The reason that Highland Archaeology Framework and Perth and Kinross worked really well is because of Grace helping. The clue's there. Who funds that? I don't know. I'm not talking about changing the planning authority or the way we fund archaeology. We've had these debates ad infinitum. But if you're serious about delivering this framework, you have to accept that the people who do it are not university people. They're not museum curators. They're part of it. They're an important part of it. It's us. And it's embedded in the local planning framework. Not national policy, not EGS. Unless you grapple with that, you'll be sitting back here in 10 years' time and you won't have changed a thing.
Can I respond to your point? Is that allowed? Yeah.
As long as you agree.
Oh, I wasn't going to, I'm afraid. Well, no, I'm not going to not agree, but I think, unless I've misunderstood you, I absolutely agree that people on the ground who are dealing with this on a daily basis need to be included. But I think that's what the regional research frameworks are doing. From the perspective of ScARF, it's closely linked with the local authority archaeologists who I speak to regularly, and this framework is possibly controversial, is kind of for them to use, and they want to use it, and they want to make sure it's written in a way that they can use it, and they can insist that not just through planning, but when, for example, another concern is that community groups might come up with a research idea, and they want to say, okay, tie this into the framework. So what I'm saying is that you've got, I totally agree with you, but I kind of think that's already been done. And listening to Susan speak and to hear about Perth and Kinross, there are much stronger links at this regional level with your term of applied archaeology than there were at the national level. And actually, isn't that one of the ways in which the two complement each other?
We're saying the same thing. We now know how it needs to be implemented, and you've just said that. Let's see if it works. Let's see if it happens. Let's see if there's the capacity. So we're actually saying the same thing.
Well, that's good news. Can we quickly go to Sally?
Yeah, and I'm just going to, I'm actually going to mention our place in time, which I never thought I would. One thing that's useful that's in there that we might want to reflect on as we go on, and one thing that's not in there that I think we also need to reflect on. So to answer that first question about why historians aren't aware of, ScARF or whatever, I think one of the key words in our place in time is mainstreaming. It was the idea that archaeology wasn't just being done by archaeologists, that it would be on the table of everybody because everybody understood the relevance of doing something that related to archaeology. And I think there's an issue with some of these research frameworks in terms of what we want to reflect on is who we've written them for and how we've written them. So I really like the Islands idea because you've just explained the relevance of it. I think we tried to do that in the Carved Stones one. We specifically targeted the curators. We've written it for curators. Who are the people who can make a difference if they understand to do things in different ways? The thing, though, that's not in our place in time is they don't consider how we understand the value of this stuff. They do use the word value, but they're talking about engagement and enjoyment. They're not actually, there's a bit of going back to my heritage cycle, there's a whole quarter that's not really in there. So the emphasis is on understanding, what happened in the past and whatever, but it's not actually written into it properly, understanding the contemporary significance and relevance of this stuff, why the islands need this and how it's going to make a difference on the ground to communities. So there's something about who it's written for and how that's expressed, and it's maybe not, they can't maybe speak to absolutely everybody. We can't maybe write them all for everybody in the wider public, if actually it's more effective to make a difference by speaking to certain target groups. So we probably want a mosaic of approaches, but mainstream so that it is relevant, the questions that are posed. And probably the modern ScARF actually attempted to do that, actually, in the way it was couched in trying to identify particular issues that could speak more to historians or whoever. But so I've covered a lot of ground there, but I think that's maybe something to come back to.
Cool. Yeah. As the thing goes up to Gavin, who I'm sorry, Rod, it's probably going to have to be the last question. Maybe we can fold yours one head. Would anyone like to respond to Sally's point?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, as taking on the role of ScARF project manager, one of the things that I'm sort of constantly thinking about with all these projects is who is it for? And sometimes I do think we're trying to make it for too many different groups of people. So we, started out as a very much more of an academic sort of type resource. And in recent years, obviously, the idea for the regionals was to make it much more of an effective local planning tool and to embed research questions in local planning requirements. But we were also talking about communities and widening it out, and then now historians and everybody else. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because I actually think it's a good thing, but it makes it, it's a juggling act to make it a useful resource for everybody. So maybe one of the discussions this afternoon is, where should ScARF go in the future, and who should it be for? And like Andy says, so in terms of the development side, applied side, it maybe hasn't been as successful as it could be, or as well used as it could be. But yeah, I think that is the question to everybody: is we need to maybe revisit who it's for and how it's used, and how it can be used in different ways.
Just to add to that, I think it's really important to recognise that the diverse audience is really difficult. And actually, I think if we're honest, our framework is for the ScARF is for curators. And I'm thinking about some of the things you were saying, Sally, about the value of archaeology. And that's why, even if our framework is for the local authority archaeologists primarily and how they're going to implement this, that it's still so vital to us that we pulled in the viewpoints of as many people as possible, because determining value and who gets to prioritise, even if community in the wider sense doesn't get to use the output, they should be inputting to it. So although I think there's a difference between participation and audience, and we need to be clear about those different roles.
Can we finally go to Gavin at the back?
Yeah, thank you for all the presentations. Very interesting, very stimulating. And I think I was just going to say a few things in relation to some of the points Sally had raised. Andy, I think your thesis, I'm very sympathetic to it. And I think you're right to identify the end users of ScARF as a research framework in terms of a process of, kind of planning and review. But I think it's been touched on. The end users of archaeological research, how do we involve them more in the applied side of things? How do we innovate there to add cultural and social value through processes that are actually very technocratic at times?
I'm not talking about the end product. I'm talking about, who's directing it, and I think we're agreeing that it is being used curatorially. Perth, Davey was quite clear about that. You've been quite clear about that. You were quite clear about that. Great. 85% of DES entries, whether we like it or not, are created by the applied sector. £5 million is spent on public sector archaeology in a year. 11 million is spent on applied archaeology. So getting the end product out there is real. How that is then used is what you're touching on, and I'm sure you'll touch on this afternoon. It's great we're talking about it's going to be used regionally. That requires, in my view, a change to a steering group approach. But what we can't do is then just lumber all this on, well, it's suddenly a regional curator's job to update all the frameworks. That's the point I'm trying to raise. It's like, it's fantastic it's getting used regionally by the people who will use it more, but that creates a number of sector-wide issues that if we ignore, you can't just pass that to somebody else now, is what I'm saying.
Sorry, yeah, so I've got an online, it's not so much a question, more of a point made. I think basically what she's saying here is that there are a load of historians out there doing work. They create reports, but there's nowhere for those reports to go. So it's not even grey lit because it's not even getting into the grey lit record. So she's looking at things like, for example, exposing the sources of financing of sites, which is currently under examination in the decolonising movement. There's no grey lit depository that is used or accessible by people out with the specialist planning departments. So, there is an issue there as well that we need to start thinking about as well in the future.
Can we give a big round of applause to our speakers?